Freedmen was the name given to slaves who had become free after the U.S. Congress passed the Confiscation Act of 1862. The act affected the Confederates who didn't surrender 60 days after the act was passed. As a punishment to those Confederates who didn't surrender, their slaves would be taken away and become freedmen. When the slaves who were confiscated became freedmen, the whites agreed to give the black colored people some rights they didn't have before. The freedmen received help and support from the Freedmen's Bureau. It was known that about 500,000 freedmen received medical attention in more than 100 different hospitals. It was also prohibited by the Civil Rights of 1875 to display any racial discrimination towards freedmen or any other black person in hotels, railroads, and theaters. When the slaves gained their freedom, they didn't know what to do. Then the North stepped in and helped the freedmen. The North collected clothing and food for the former slaves. There were some freedmen who had decided to stay in Mississippi and Georgia and had found schools they could attend and enroll their children in, if they had any. Many of the freedmen didn't have a home to go back to after they had gained their freedom. Since the freedmen were former slaves, they had always been provided with a place to stay on the plantations and/or masters' homes where they were slaves. They took refuge in stockades. The stockades became overcrowded and many died from diseases. Owners of large plantations began to abandon their lands because they no longer had slaves to work the lands for them. When the government found out that certain lands had been abandoned, they offered them to the freedmen. Freedmen were offered to become sharecroppers of the abandoned lands where they once used to be slaves at. Other freedmen who weren't offered to become sharecroppers or just simply didn't want to do it migrated to refuge camps. Freedmen who didn't become sharecroppers for whatever reason were hired by loyal Unionist plantation owners. The freedmen were paid minimum wages at these plantations. A small percentage of freedmen found jobs at iron foundries and steel mills. Other freedmen joined the military services and rendered service to the army. Freedmen experienced a backlash of Southern white people's fear and anger. An organization called the Ku Klux Klan was formed. They didn't care if black people were free people. They still produced acts of violence towards the freedmen. Lynching them was one of those acts of violence. Black codes were laws passed in the southern United States. These laws limited the rights of African Americans to work in various professions. It limited their rights to buy, own, and sell property, make legally binding contracts, serve on juries, own weapons, and vote or run for any political office.